Afternoon, everyone. A brief announcement before we begin today. For those of you with a cell phone or electronic device, we'd ask that you please turn it to silent for the duration of the service today. In lieu of flowers, donations in Carl's memory may be made to the ACLU, the University of Michigan Musical Society, or the Residential College. And another announcement is that immediately following the service here in the sanctuary, all of you are very cordially invited to join us in a formal funeral procession that will take us to Forest Hill Cemetery, where Dr. Cohen will be buried. I know that several of you have joined in that procession, but if you have not and you would like to, please see myself or my associate, and we'll make you a part of the procession today. While we are in procession, please have your high beam headlights on and your four-way flashers. Please also follow the cars ahead of you very closely. We are going to take a special route today, which takes us close to Carl's home. So just be aware of that as we travel along as well. But please avoid using distractions like your cell phone while we are in procession today. Shiva will be observed at the home of Matthew Graff and Leslie Lawher, 900 Minor, today, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 7 p.m. And of course, all of you are welcome to go to their home following the burial today to offer comfort as well. Thank you.
לכל זמן, ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים, עת ללדת ועת למות, עת לטעת ועת לקורנטוע, עת להרוג ועת לרפוא, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות. עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות, עת לבכות ועת לפסוק. There's a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting, a time for hurting and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing and a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones, a time for gathering them up and placing them on top of the grave. A time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking. The Jewish funeral begins with ripping and speaking. In the days of old, you'd rip part of your garment, still done today, and the ribbon serves as a part of your garment. And in ancient days, in Talmudic times, you would sew up the garment at the end of the grieving period. And you would continue to wear that garment in life. Not everyone went and bought new clothes all the time, so people could see where you stood in the club that no one really wants to be a part of. You who are here today and you who are streaming the service, you know the internal tearing of the heart, the internal heartbreak that the ribbon means, and you are here to hear the speaking today. And there will be time for silences, and in time for sewing up, time for healing. I'm going to ask those who are wearing the ribbon today to please rise and repeat after me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Dayan ha'emet, which means, praised are you, God, whose presence fills the universe, who is the true judge. And will you rip a little bit farther up in the ribbon? and we may be seated. On behalf of all of us who are supporting the family, we offer our deepest condolences. To Carl's children, Jacqueline and Noah, to his nephews and nieces and their spouses, Matthew and Leslie, David and Lori, Miriam and Melvin, Ron Bloom, and to his 7 great-nieces and nephews and 4 great-great-nieces and nephews, and to many close friends. We will begin with the speaking at this time. We'll begin with Carl's nephew, Matt Graff, followed by Carl's daughter, Jacqueline, and then his nephew, David Graff, followed by his niece, Miriam Graff, and then his son, Noah, followed by the rabbis.
I've been on this beamer before. Not lately. As Rabbi said, on behalf of our family, I want to thank each of you for being here with us today to honor the memory of my uncle, the younger brother of my mother. He was one of the first people to hold me when I was a tiny baby, and he has been in my world every day of my life until Saturday morning. I know that this is a natural outcome. I've known for a while that the great circle of life would one day close for Carl. This day remains a shock to my system. I'm not ready. I miss him. And I grieve this loss. Your presence is a sustaining and true comfort. Thank you. Over the past couple of days, I have heard from several friends about the influence that Carl had on their lives. A fervent free thinker, a lifelong inspiration for me as a person and as a teacher. I know he was a character, and I cared for him a lot. He taught me how to think critically. I went into the law because of Carl and Perry Mason. There are countless stories and vignettes that feature Carl Cohen's outsized impact on the world, his effect on his students, his relations with his family, and his contributions to the many, many special interest communities that he inhabited. He loved variety in his discourse, in his travels, in his companions, in his arguments, in his dogs, in every aspect of the natural world. He expressed that same love through his diverse fascinations and his zest for life. And of course, by sharing his observations with all of us, slowly and clearly, loudly, constantly, freely. That's what I wanted to say, but our cousin Ron Bloom is in California today. He sent a poem that Ron, wrote in 1989. I felt immediately that this poem captured the sense of wonder and excitement and glamour that enveloped all of us growing up with Uncle Carl. A memorandum. My uncle debating anti-vivisectionists on the national radio news? Why didn't I get advance notice? I'd have gotten tickets for friends and family. I'll send him a card, a letter, a note, a billet doux, some sort of thing. A letter would be better. A note, a short letter, or a card. That's the best way. A note or a letter, a card or a letter, of course. I'll send him a letter with a leaf or a flower, a leaf pressed between the pages of a book as a sort of emblem, a seal. That would put it to him. That settles it. Settled then, it'll be a card, a note, or a letter with a leaf, a sliver of a letter, a memento, a billet, a letter for the letter carrier to take to the letter box. Should it be a letter after all? Perhaps a note or a memorandum, a jotting or a scribbling on the back of an envelope or a napkin or a bib, a pipkin, a hanky. I'll settle it then, a jotting or a scribbling on tissue on a napkin or a bib, in a quick scrawl, a scribbling or scrawling, it'll be handy. Then that's settled then. A note on a napkin and a very short note, a scrawl, a scrim, a scoff. It's bound to set things right. A note or a letter, yes. A note or a letter, a note or a card, a note in a box. And within that, another box. And within it, another box. And within that, another, and another, and another. And within that box, a very tiny little jade homunculus from China. I know Ron would have been with us here today if he could have been. He's can't travel. That's everything from me.
Jackie, will you come up at this time?
I want to share with you all a few of my favorite stories about or from my dad. They're not related to one another, except that they each are a little part of showing me how amazing he was. He would often tell me throughout my life, even though that was only a small part of his, that he had a pretty great life, eh? He'd say, how fortunate we are. And he was right. The first story is a story that he would tell, one that I heard so many times, and one I can't possibly tell as well as he could, but he loved to tell it, and I thought how much he loved to tell it said a lot about him. About this time he was traveling back from Europe on a huge ship sometime in the mid-20th century, and he met a young British woman on the ship, and he invited her back to, as he said, his aunt's apartment in New York City for dinner. And he always said sort of something like this. He'd say, my aunt was a wonderful person, and she was a very observant Jewish person, of course, very observant. And of course, this young woman from Britain, she was not Jewish. She had never heard of kosher before. Nothing like that. Of course. She was unaware. Go on like this for a while. So they ate the meal, and he reminded me that it was wonderful, that his aunt was wonderful, and that she was such a good host. And this young woman thanked his aunt for the delicious meal, he would say. And afterward, his aunt, of course, offered everyone coffee. And at this point, my dad would look so delighted about what was to come in the story. And the British woman said, oh, well, could I have some cream with my coffee, please? And my dad would look around and say, of course, this wasn't possible. But she didn't know. So he would talk about how wonderful a host his aunt was, and how she said, I think that might be possible. And she pulled up a little table next to their other table, and she put a bit of cream and a bit of coffee on that table, and they had their coffee, and it was wonderful, and he would always say it was so clever. And I'm sure I have some details wrong, and I'm sure I have some traditions wrong, even though I heard it so many times. But it was always a good story, and I love how much pleasure he took in telling the story, and the way he would remember all these details about others and how special they were. Another story, my dad taught me to drive in several parts. First on a golf cart on an island in Florida where the rule was that you could drive the golf carts if you were 12. He let me drive them when I was 8 because he trusted me. And on a tractor when I was much younger than 8 because he trusted me. And I've learned talking with my family that this was part of a bigger pattern. But he was always trusting me to try something even if I had never done it before. He would just say, "Oh, come on, you can do it." And then when I was 21 or so and struggling to drive a manual car, he took me to a parking lot and he patiently, carefully taught me how to drive it. And I was so worried that he would be frustrated with me because I wasn't picking it up. But he could actually be a very patient, clear teacher, as I'm sure some know, even though I know many who have known my dad haven't always thought of patient as the first word that comes to mind. So a third is, as some of you might know very well, my dad would hire his students to babysit my brother and I when we were kids. It's a pretty nice deal. And one of them, he had take me to my very first Pride March on the Diag, and it was a different time. It was probably about 1997, and I remember as babysitter and my dad had a conversation about it, and I don't remember many of the details. There's a Pride March tonight, can I take your daughter? And I remember him saying something similar, like, "Great, take Jack along." So the first of many, and that means a lot to me. And finally, I'm sure most of you know that my dad was one of the founders of the residential college, and he was so proud of that. And I attended the residential college. I wanted to. He had shown me what a special place it was, and I knew if I wasn't there, that would be where I would want to be. And my dad had a lot of opinions. And he taught me that it was always okay to have an opinion and that you should have the tools to defend it if you believe it's right. And that's something that has always meant so much to me, that he helped to build a place and encouraged me to be in a place full of people who helped shape my opinions about the world, and how I thought about the world, and who helped me to build fundamental ideas about what I thought was right. And in a lot of cases, and not all, but a lot of cases, I ended up discovering that I fundamentally disagreed with my dad in many ways. We did not see eye to eye on many topics. And I love that he made that possible for me. He was always looking to build places where people could fight for what they thought was right, even if it wasn't what he thought. And even when we were in totally different places on the how or the what, he was always wanting to make things possible for people. And he made so much possible for me and so many of us.
David?
I'm just going to basically read to help me get through this. L'chaim, to life. If Carl was leading our gathering, at some point he would urge us all a drop of whiskey and make that toast one of his favorites. Sadly, he cannot. And we cannot make that toast today in quite the same way that we usually do, celebrating a happy occasion together. This is a moment of profound loss and sadness. Nevertheless, feeling our deep attachments, honoring and remembering Carl, accepting this difficult passage as part of life's rich experience, appropriate or not, l'chaim. Life was precious to Carl. He loved being here. He'd often say he was happy keeping his own company, but he clearly and deeply, dearly loved the close company of others, you and me, and many more. Not to mention, of course, his beloved dogs. And he also loved all the fine features and facets of the world that he inhabited, even nuances, though sharp lines were preferred. He was charming, engaging, irresistibly, intensely, always. Whether it was tighter speech, grammar, and prose he wanted, or a tighter spiral on your football pass, Carl was demanding and challenging, rather superior. But even his harsh critiques were a kind of honor and praise for the greatness embedded in the world and in you and me, which he picked up with strong and thoughtful insight. Most of all, sharing such stuff and more, Carl was a hell of a lot of fun. He loved humor, he loved to joke, he loved if you would joke back. I learned from spending time with Carl that pleasures are worthy pursuits, more than fine, even lofty. Enjoyment is essential. Why the heck not go for that? Never mind the dark and gloomy stuff. Break a barrier or bend a rule. Dig in to get it if you really want. My own folks might have left me and my sibs a little short on that in their encouragement to work hard, do good, be loving and kind. But luckily, Uncle Carl was around too. He gave us a lot of joy in a lot of ways. So much. Walking the Arb down to the river or walking all over the world, he walked and talked our asses off. He practiced making a personal friend in every encounter. He welcomed hundreds to his numerous grand celebrating parties or intimate dinners. He took us to steep hills for sledding and many other places. He played games with us, all kinds, not only chess. He brought puzzles and good presents to make us ever more clever with the puzzles. Pete Hine was the inventor of the Soma cube, which is a three-dimensional thing you put together. That was like an example of something that Carl liked. And Pete Hine was also a poet. He had a short little piece that I happen to recall, said, "Love while you have love to give, live while you have life to live." Carl loved little poems and rhymes of this sort also. Okay, so yeah, he brought us games, puzzles. He had us driving cars much too young, which was scary but fun. He told tales, true tales, and exaggerated for enlivening effect. He shared his love of music, languages, and literature, the New York Times, the view, the sea, the sky, the air, trees, sports, delicious food, dessert, knowledge of innumerable facts, and of course, his opinion on any matter at all. While reciting that matters of taste aren't arguable, he'd frequently argue them anyway. I thought so. It drove me nuts. That and claiming his personal opinions as facts. But even if he could go too far, it's a human failing. We've all got our compulsions, and those traits are treasure. He was sure to infect or provoke you with his emphatic enthusiasms, be they insights, idle musings, or groundless pronouncements. Maybe sometimes he was even right, but don't tell him I said so. Being a wobbly, somewhat insecure, relentlessly qualifying, too tolerant, moderating, mediating type myself, I needed to adopt and integrate some of Carl's definitive ways to be happier. And palling around with him helped me get there. It's just one thing that I'm grateful for. He had sadnesses, of course, there's no escaping them. He could also be disappointed, disgusted, dismissive, outraged. He was impatient. He was also patient, as Jackie noted, but he was impatient. I just want to mention a printed page hangs in his study with one large, bold-faced word: now. Impatience has its virtues. Why wait? Now. No time like the present. Carl would say he never worked a day in his life because he enjoyed all he did and the world around him so very much. He was thrilled, lit up, no dimmer switch. Expounding his exuberance, he was thrilling to be with. He went in hard for rich experience in a big life. He was richly rewarded with exactly that. And he was gracious, deeply grateful for all of it and all of us. You know this. You don't need me to tell you. It was a shock to me the day I realized, after too many years of idolizing this very sharp guy, that he was also just a guy. Special, but just possibly a jerk like the rest of us. I cried when I found out. Maybe he did too. It wasn't easy going, but from there, he wasn't just my uncle, my professor, mentor, or honored elder, but better than all that, a true friend. New levels kicked in. I feel very lucky that we got there. But this is getting to be about me. Back to Carl, he was prideful, but he had a lot to be proud of. As a property owner, a collector of rocks, shells, little magnets and doodads, pictures, poems, books, and more books. As an employer, a landlord, a homeowner. This on top of all the authorship, community, civil liberty, standard bearing, and education matters that made his professional career. His way with any neighbor, community member, or acquaintance, and with those close companions he clung to and hugged tightly at home and around the world, and who hugged him back. I won't extend the list more. It could be done, but not least was his pride and love for his children, Jackie and Noah. Special thoughts and feelings for these two. Today, we got to let Carl go, and we'll be missing him. A profound loss already, but he gave so much. Even when it stung, he helped a ton. He helped dreams come true that sometimes we didn't even know we had. He made a deep, bold, and indelible mark in everyone he touched. We'll always have that and carry it forward. That doesn't die. Thank you for hearing my reflections. I don't know how you capture a man like this with such talk. It's impossible, of course. One mere moment more with him would be so much better. Alas. Thank you.
I guess it's a testament to Carl that we all have something to say, as he did. I'm Miriam, Carl's niece. I would say Carl was larger than life, right? Even when we didn't want it to be so, as a family, when my brothers and our cousins and our children would get together, it was inevitable that the conversation would evolve to Carl's latest accomplishments or trips or adventures. And we were so fortunate to share in many of those. And more about that at Shiva if you come there. One of the amazing things about Carl was his ability to provide great presents. At his party for his 50th anniversary at the university, my son spoke about that, and he was only 9. And then my brother spoke about it, and then I spoke about it. So one of the later speakers got up and asked how they could get on the list of people to get some of these great presents. So, well, I think I can say all of us here are blessed with having received so many gifts from Carl. His time, the sparkle in his eye, his effusive nature, the lively and thought-provoking conversations. These are all gifts we received from him that will keep on giving and will be with us for our lifetimes and honestly for generations to come. He just inspired us all. So thank you for being here, and may his memory be for a blessing.
For the first half of my life, I studied at my father's table, and for the second half, I studied at the world's table. On the whole, I think I learned more at my father's. That's a quote my father taught me at his table, but I didn't get it quite right, and I couldn't tell you who said it. He could have, but you're hearing my version now, and it's not meant to be correct. I'm not as good with names and dates as my dad was, and anyway, goodbyes aren't meant to be correct. I also want you to understand why I say my father's table. If you dine with us, and I do mean dined and don't mean had dinner, you will know that it took place at a heavy rectangular table with one long side facing the kitchen, my sister's side, a long side that faces the living room, my side, and then that faces towards the grand mantel with its shiny fiddly silver puzzles and enormous Baroque mirror, the guest's end, and last, the end directly beneath that mantel and that mirror, where sat one person, and that was the head of the table, because it was where my father sat. Everyone at that table couldn't help but see both themselves and my father, except for my father, who saw both and neither. My father knew things. He treated belief as knowledge, and I appreciated that, but it also made him inflexible sometimes, though perhaps I'm just unappreciative of many things. That was a constant reprimand of my father. He was right, of course. He was usually right to such an extent that you disagreed, but that you couldn't honestly say he was wrong, just that you disagreed. He was on the college debate team, which should come as a surprise to absolutely no one. Carl, I don't know if I've ever called him Carl to his face before. Hey, Carl, I'm Noah. Nice to meet you. Carl, whose actual name was Kopel, was in his heart a civil rights activist fighting for over half a century, fiercely on the side of equality and humanism. The ambient cultural sense of those conversations shifted around him, but he didn't change much. We changed around him. Halfway through any debate, assuming you weren't furious by that point, you felt the weight lifting because you realized he wasn't going to change, and this wasn't truly debating. He'd read more than you read about this since 20 years ago, and he'd had the same conversation with Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes and with Peter Singer in a book he authored. So you were really not debating with him. You were just discussing while standing on the edifice of his experience, which was better in a lot of ways, but it could be vexing if you were a kid who just wanted a pat on the head. My dad's sense of social fairness put emphasis on certain underlying values and stayed consistent all his life. He fought the government in pursuit of equality on all fronts. He fought McCarthyism. He fought his own university, which he loved countless times. If you didn't know my father personally, read his essay on civil disobedience, which you can Google later. If you're someone who came here thinking he was an ass, read that. He was philosophically very much on the side of asses and thought they could provide a lot of value to the world, given that these were thoughtful asses. His whole life stands testament to this. He was never afraid to act as he saw fit. He would warble out a German poem to my grade school friends or interrupt us to disagree. But it was always with the greater picture in mind, with you in mind. In his own mind, Carl, my dad, thought of himself as an island walker, a fine storyteller, an avid reader of the New York Times, a philosopher, a professor, and a dog lover. If you visited him at the table, you probably know all this. He never hid his high estimation of himself, and it was uniquely enjoyable to be in the presence of that confidence. When he told a story, and he would always be telling a story, he would look at you such that he was only half seeing you, the other half of him seeing his story, which was his mirror. Remember the table? He had 1,000 stories, most of them mostly true. And I was going to tell a couple of those stories, but I can't because it was never about the stories. It was about how he told them, and I'm not my father. I'm not even using my hands. That was how it was, so that was how it was supposed to be at my father's table, which still sits in 16 Ridgeway, the house that was my home until 3 days ago. You have so many accolades, Dad. I bet you didn't recognize the silly heroisms. They're smaller, loves austere and lonely offices, but you never settled with respect to offices. You wrestled with me on the carpet, caught little frogs with me wading through a pond at the Matai Botanical Gardens. You played pool with me, brought me to the CCRB to play squash at the spry age of 74. Took me and my friends to football games, which I hated because that stadium is so loud, and some of us have ears that work, you know. You edited my god-awful essays, which, when you were in a good mood, you complimented so deftly I could barely tell they were god-awful. And speaking of austere and lonely offices, I know you threw a full fit when they stuck you in that austere little office without a window after East Quad, whose residential college you founded was renovated. And I happen to know this because you sent an email to literally everyone calling the university out, which is something that only a few people would have the audacity to do, but god damn it if you were always going to be that person. If you can possibly share a love of something with your parents, and your dad's favorite culture is flamboyant German opera music and Immanuel Kant, I recommend dogs as a good place to start. Being dropped off at my elementary school from a Lincoln Town car blasting Schubert at 80 decibels is an experience I could have done without, but coming home from that school to a dog wiggling his butt with happiness and licking my face off made me who I am as much as the table did. Daydreaming about being an adult, I always imagined having kids and arguing with my dad by a park bench near the River Raisin over a glass of cheap bourbon, my dad's favorite whiskey, despite it being objectively disgusting. Whether my dogs or my children were more beautiful, I don't know which side each of us would have taken in that debate. Each time I have the daydream, it alternates. This comes from a night I was very young when one guest pointed over to where I was playing with Charlie the dog and asked Carl, which one do you like more? And my dad said he'd think about it. The smell of bourbon reminds me of my dad's breath across a chessboard. We'd play chess like this, he with a glass in one hand and a book in the other, I glaring at the board for minutes per turn, searching desperately for a sequence that didn't immediately lose me the game, and I'd finally make a move, immediately ask to take it back, make a different move, and in the space of a long sigh, my dad would take a sip of bourbon, immediately make his move, and then turn his attention back to the book. The first time I beat him, he smiled and slapped my back 3 times, and I thought I'd never do anything in my life better than that. The last time I beat him, when he visited me in my graduate school in Bolzano, Italy, he resigned in an angry flourish. That last time we both expected to win. Now that's chess. My dad... Yeah, maybe it would have made me enjoy the game more if he'd let me win when I was small. Maybe I should have let him win that last game, but that's not the Cohen way. That wouldn't be chess. Having Carl Cohen as your dad in Ann Arbor was a bit weird. It was like they'd judge you half for yourself and half upon finding out you were Professor Cohen's son. And that second judgment mattered to me as much as the first, and it still does. For a good reason. What's the capital of Czechoslovakia? I'd ask him. Actually, no, Czechoslovakia was dissolved on December 31st, 1993, but while it existed, its capital was Prague. Now tell me something, kiddo. How many days did you and Czechoslovakia exist simultaneously? And I would do mental math at the dinner table. 365 times 2, and I'm born on Christmas Day, so plus 6, because 736 days? Close, but no cigar. 737 days. 1992 is a leap year. You must add one. Remember the Pirates of Penzance. My dad was a romantic at heart, capital R. He loved sailing and poetry, music and books, and walking. My father never ever got tired of traveling to new places just to walk them, especially islands. He felt that if he could circumambulate an entire island, it was like he conquered that island in his own special way. He always took a walking stick with him, which he always took a walking stick with him, which he would be castigated for calling a cane, and if his stick was confiscated by airport attendants, it became my responsibility to find him a new good walking stick, scrubbing through the brush of whatever island we'd be visiting. And he'd turn down stick after stick. He was really picky. He thought of it as a staff, an expression of himself as an intrepid explorer, and I think that's how he'd like you to remember him. You only get one dad, which feels especially true if your dad was the main character of a great adventure and you were the sidekick along for the ride. And now that I don't get to be that sidekick anymore, I miss it. But since I can only be my own main character now, it's got to be me telling people who hate olives they don't know what they're missing and arrogantly reciting old poetry. And I wrote significantly more, but even what I brought is too much. So I think I could talk forever about him. And if my dad had a choice for how this ended, I think he'd like a little flair, a dramatic climax. So in his honor, since I really have no idea how to finish, I'll let you go with one of his favorite poems written in 1902, the old poem Sea Fever by the English poet John Masefield. Goodbye, Dad. I hope you have a sweet dream. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and sky. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And the wheels kick, and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a gray mist on the sea's face, and a gray dawn breaking. I must go down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying, and the flung spray and the blown spume, and the seagulls crying. I must go down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the gull's way and the whale's way, where the wind's like a whetted knife. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover, and quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over.
And I hope for those who come to Shiva, they can encourage you to read even more of your beautiful writing. You're so much like your father. It's really, it's like having a strong part of his presence here today. I'm going to invite Rabbi Dalberson up to share a few words right now.
And thank you. It's an honor to be here, and my condolences to the family and to all of us gathered here. And it's my honor to say some words in memory of Carl. I served as a rabbi of this congregation for 30 years. I had the opportunity to know Carl, but I learned some things in the obituary that I didn't know. I knew about the chess because one year, very soon after I came here, we invited a scholar in residence to come, a professor of mine, and when I all of a sudden got a phone call from Carl Cohen saying, "I can't believe so-and-so is coming here. We used to play chess together when we were kids, when we were teenagers." He says, "You have to arrange a meeting with me with him." So I said, "Well, sure." So he came over to our house for one of the meals while the professor was here, and watching the two of them interact was incredible. I felt so good to be part of a reunion like that. But that was when I first got a real look at how Carl impacted other people, including people that I didn't even know he impacted, and I'm sure that's the case for so many. But there were other things in that obituary I didn't know. I didn't, for some reason, know he was such a walker. And when I read that he had hiked Angel's Landing at Zion National Park at age 77, I was absolutely shocked. And the reason I was shocked is because last summer I was at Zion National Park with our son, who had hiked Angel's Landing when he was a teenager, and I said to him, "Hey, do you think we might be able to do this? I might be able to." And he gave me one of those looks, and I knew never to ask again. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't go anywhere near Angel's Landing. So I was so impressed with that. But what I really remember was Carl interacting with the Jewish community here. And my first impression of Carl was in 1989 in the spring, a few months after I arrived here. I wandered into the Jewish Community Center's annual, at the time, Lat Kahamantashen Purim debate. Now, I see some people nodding their heads, those whose memory in the Jewish community goes back that far, and were here then. And Carl was the moderator, and I know that moderators aren't really supposed to be the story of a debate. And I will say he tried. He tried not to be the story. No, he didn't really try. He was really, really the story. His performance was worth the price of admission alone. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, "That was really very impressive." I said, "That was great." He said, "Good, you're on for next year." So I was one of the participants in the debate the following year, and I happen to have, and I consider it to be priceless in many ways, I actually have a videotape of that debate. And I watched it this morning, and I watched Carl's introduction, which was a combination of introducing the participants, a parody of a Gilbert and Sullivan song, which he had the entire group sing even though we didn't want to, and his choice of words, which were just phenomenal. He really, that was in his element. And that was part of what we enjoyed and we benefited from as a community. But what I really want to comment on briefly is Carl's connection with this congregation. He was, as you know, a former president of the congregation, and he gave so much time and effort and supported the congregation. He loved it. The services meant so much to him, and I can still picture him, of course, sitting right over there on the high holidays and coming up for the first aliyah on Rosh Hashanah, the first one to say the blessing before the reading of the Torah. I'll get back to that in a moment. But what he did that was really meaningful to me was after the holidays, on several occasions, he wrote me a note, handwritten, even in the days of email, handwritten note thanking me for leading the services. And I was very honored by that and by his comments. He also, I know, was a great supporter of the renovation of our chapel downstairs here in the synagogue, which is of great personal importance to me, but really importance to the entire congregation. But going back to the Rosh Hashanah services and the Aliyah for a moment, he would come up and he would say the blessings for the Torah. And I know that he was studying Hebrew, and he had done a lot of studying of biblical Hebrew, wanted to understand the language more. And when he said the blessings, he emphasized a different word that many people do who really understand the blessings in the Hebrew. He would say, Asher natan lanu, and he would say the word lanu and banu really with emphasis, and those mean for us, who gave us the Torah. He would emphasize that word, and it always impressed me, because I think it showed how proud he was of us a people, us a tradition, us a synagogue. And he'll always be remembered here at Beth Israel. May his memory be for a blessing.
I suppose it's the way us rabbis operate, that I will always think of Carl Cohen as the Rosh Hashanah Kohen Aliyah. And by the way, that's only when people show up. Somehow, no one was there for earlier parts of the service. And then Carl would be ready for the Kohen Aliyah, and then suddenly there are 600 people just walked in. So I was like, Carl, how did you know that was when everyone shows up to listen? And I was always be in touch with Carl just before Rosh Hashanah, when I would check in to see if he was still able to come or when we recorded him so we could stream it when we were not able to be in person. And he was so happy. You know, the dogs were jumping around and I was filming it at home, and he was ripping off his mask and I didn't know what to do. And you know, and then like we're streaming this to, you know, thousands of people, and I'm not allowed to do this, but Carl would interrupt with translation, right? Asher b'charbanu, it's for us, it's the Torah's. I was like, you know, and so only the Cohen Gadol, the great high priest, can do such things. So I just want to talk briefly, and I know we've heard so much, I can't capture everything with Carl, and Shiva's hopefully we can even bring in a few more facets, just about him as a Cohen. So for those who don't know, just briefly, I mean, in the Torah, the vast amount of people were Israelites. We're the people. And then you have this smaller very small section called the Levites, and the Levites serve the people. So you go into the temple, the Levites are the musicians, and they're playing, and you've got the Levites they're the first responders, they're the public servants, they're doing the first aid, they're giving directions, they're helping people up the stairs, they're telling people where to go, they're building and fixing, they're in charge of the building, they're collecting money and redistributing. And then you have the smallest layer, this tiny layer, being a Cohen, being the priests. And it's not for everybody. You are the front of show. Being the front of show is not for everyone. You are in the special gowns, you are in the middle, you are accepting people's sacrifices, you are doing the sacrifices with the animals, and yes, I'm going to come back to killing animals in a little while, just to make sure you know. You are the one, and when it comes for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you are teaching people, this is the meaning of the ritual, this is why we're doing it, you are the great teachers. Carl was the front of the show. He seized on it. He loved it. And if I could have told him, Carl, you can come up and you can bow down to the ground and go into the Holy of Holies, I think Carl would have said, I was just waiting for the invitation. When do I go on? The Cohen was also the teacher of the moral holiness code. So the holiness code, many people don't realize, is most of Leviticus. It's huge, and other parts of the Torah. And it is the message from the priesthood to the rest of us, and we read a whole bunch of it on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is reserved for the holiness code, but pieces of it are actually all around the Torah. And the essence of the holiness code and its biblical source is that the human being is made in God's image. And that comes from it in chapter 1. And this stands in tension with the tribal codes, the latter being the sections of the Torah that lean into the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that lean into family, the centrality of family, kinship and clan ties, the tracing of your ethnicity and your tribal identity. But for the priestly source, the teachings that the priests constantly propagate are the ones that say that God is not a person-like entity one talks to and takes an interest in your personal life and in your family. God is the abstract, transcendent quality of mind and morality combined that suffuses creation. And it is that quality, the ability to make oneself holy through using it, meaning one makes oneself serve the good by embracing the image of God within you, the power of intellectual and moral reason to do incredible things, to recreate and to refine. It's from the holiness code that we get, how do you love the stranger as yourself? How do you examine yourself to treat all people fairly and equally? How do you see yourself judged and accountable in the universe, not by heritage or belief, but by your actions? As the most influential rabbi of the last millennium put it, God is the universe's active intellect. And you join with God in using that intellect within you and serving it. God does not take an interest in you as a person. God takes an interest in what kind of person you can become and what kind of society and fellows you have made. As Carl either did say or would have said, the mind is where the humanity is. Use your mind. In the mind, we are all equal. Who else gets on the radio and broadcasts himself reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason? The holiness, the image of God within you. It's funny, I have it right behind my desk, and I was thinking of teaching a mini course on the critique of pure reason next year. I had no idea that Carl had this history with it. Some of Carl's most famous positions come from the Cohen source of the Torah. Yes, the priestly code of Leviticus, to be read on Yom Kippur morning, commands us to provide to the poor and to the needy. Lift them out of poverty, there should be no needy among you. Recognize that all possessions are in the end only borrowed from God and at some point returned, so share large portions of them now. Only a couple of verses from these imperatives comes, you shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your neighbor fairly and equally. For the priest, one must make a hard and fast distinction between social policy and purposes and cases of judgment. For the latter cannot compromise fairness, that each are not favored. Carl's opinions about affirmative action may have been unpopular, and I know Carl was surprised that colleagues took his positions personally. But I recognized them immediately, as do his kids. Do not show favor or show deference to the privileged or to the underprivileged in judgment. To do so, however well-intended, may lead to a pity that will erode the fundamental recognition of the image of God in everyone, the mind, the power, the dignity, which is the soul. And how about animals? The priestly code commands us to recognize that taking the animal life is murder, plain and simple. For all animal life is sacred, and yet, as long as one acknowledges the animal's life and apologizes for taking it for human use, then human uses are valid as long as they are not wasteful and not too cruel. Whereas the tribal historian remembers Noah taking 1 pair of each species onto the ark, the priestly code remembers Noah taking 7 pairs of those species that could come in handy for human use and for God's purposes. For many, understandably, this is uncomfortable or morally impoverished view. I myself am a vegetarian. But for the Cohen, blurring the line between human and animal life can lead us to forget what makes us most human, which is our moral agency. To equalize the agency of humans and animals, while seemingly admirable, is to gradually erode our moral agency, the beautiful gift from God that connects our minds with ultimate responsibility. And maybe it was for this reason that only the priests, the very few members of the people that served that way, were permitted to take the lives of the sacrificial animals. Maybe it was because they were the keepers of this high moral principle, even when obscured for the rest of us. As Jackie told me, my dad taught me we should stand up for what is right. So just a few things, I'll close. What are the other qualities of the priests? They were the authors and keepers of the holiness code. They were the teachers and the teachers of teachers. They were the ones who pronounced the phrases of ancient liturgies, the way Carl spontaneously recited poetry in Shakespeare. They were the ones who called upon the temple musician Levites to come up and fill the temple with ancient music. And if you, like Jackie or Noah, asked him to turn it down, or it just wasn't what a 15-year-old wanted to hear, well, then he was going to turn it up. So it was at a blaring volume, producing the ears that probably weren't as strong as they could have been in an older age. And maybe you even had to hear the whole opera now, or the entire Schubert composition. Unless, of course, the Musical Society had snuck in a more modern composition, then we are leaving at intermission. For a Cohen, family comes second. It's all through the Torah. Because the focus is on spreading the universal message to everyone. The residential college is really your residence. It's really your family. And you do have your own family, but too often they come second. Because your focus is on making every person who came up to that altar feel special. As Rabbi Daberson and others have spoken, I can't believe he did it to me, and I didn't know him like you did. His kindness to me was amazing. When I accepted the job and changed my whole life after a career in California, he was the only person that wrote me a letter. He wrote me such a long letter. It's like he knew about my exams in Kant and Kierkegaard. He knew about my background in philosophy. It was deeply gracious. But I know probably when he was writing me that letter, he wasn't doing something for a family member that he might have been doing. When I met my wife, I wasn't sure about her. We met later in life. And she was completely different from me. She was like artistic and a ballroom dance person, and that just sounds like everything on my dating profile I would say is a non-starter. As an intellectual, and when I walked into her home the first time, quite nervous, I'd made a mistake even in continuing the dating, I saw that Introduction to Logic by Carl and Irving Copy was holding up the monitor to her computer. And I figured she had never read it, so I opened it up and it was marked all the way through. And I asked her, did you get it used? And she said, no. She said, I love psychology, but that's the book that taught me how to think. With all the business of public life, Carl did expect others to serve him. The Levites used to wash the hands and feet of the Cohens, and as far as I can tell, Carl couldn't even make a cup of tea. And that's hard on family. Carl expected things to be there when he needed them. As Noah reminded me, who walks into the University Athletic Center? Your locker is right in the front, one of those ancient ones with the ancient brass key. He loved the old things. Anyone who's still famous a few centuries after they died is to be admired. The Cohen is the talker and the teacher. No one could interrupt him, but he could interrupt Kant. He could interrupt Torah. They're there to teach you. Your job, get A's. And if you are a Cohen, the child of a male Cohen, filial loyalty is paramount. To take your place, to do what I do, to prepare it for me at this point. Ask questions and think things through so you can see why my way is right. And in Noah, he gained the apostle he so much craved. And in Jackie, he got the person to expand her father's horizons. The Cohen postpones their own grief and the needs of their family members. They are the only ones. And I think of Jackie's graduation from residential college, which happened to conflict with Carl's, was it 80th birthday party? Carl loved a party. Replete, by the way, his party with simulcasting from the Met. He casually insisted on the days that Jackie must be the first one to be graduated so he can hand her the degree and go to his party, even though the entire order had been worked out, obviously, for months. Well, he had actually asked that the date be changed, but he was told that that was not possible. I imagine Jackie sitting there thinking, my dad, he serves the community before he serves the family. Although in that day, he remained all the way through the ceremony until it was Jackie's turn. And then, standing in front of everybody, he presented her degree to her, got up and left, and went to the birthday party. She went first. Finally, I was moved by what Noah said about Carl's staff. Were you able to find it?
Yeah, he's being very good.
So, the head Kohen gets a staff. The others don't. It established the authority of the high priest of the Israelites, whether it was descended from, identical to, or modeled on the staff of Moses, the one that stomped the ground when Moses declared, let my people go, or when Moses lifted his arms at the top of the hill when the Israelites went into battle below. Carl would have loved doing those things, by the way. It was the sign that God's vitality and message can burst forth at any moment through its bearer. And when a challenge for the priesthood leadership took place in the Torah, it chose the true bearer by bursting into almond blossoms. Carl loved his walking stick. It was the way he claimed his territory, because if he could walk around it, and they spoke English and there were no cars, it belonged to him and it was his territory. Here we are just before Rosh Hashanah. The gates to the next life, the gates to our futures, slowly opening, fully opening on Rosh Hashanah when the Torah service begins with the opening of the Ark and the Kohen Aliyah, and mostly closes on Yom Kippur as we read that holiness code and slowly inch it closer to close. Carl has that walking stick, that staff. And after dying with the special blessing that comes and dying on Shabbat, I know that he is circumambulating and conquering that territory as the Kohen Gadol, led by his staff into the next life. And if, as a rationalist, that next life is like the rabbis who were more rationalist in the Talmud say, Perhaps the next life is what we don't know, but perhaps the next life is the immortality of being published in your lifetime and having your teachings read in the future, so you're remembered with a blessing. Then we know Carl certainly has already conquered that territory. May his memory bring a blessing, and may he rest in peace. I ask you to please rise for the memorial prayer. El male rachamim, shochen b'hameromim, hamse menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashechina, b'ma'alot kedoshim utehorim, kezohar harakia mahazirim, et nishmat kapel Mordechai, ben Yaakov HaKohen veYehudit, shehalach le'olamo began Eden tehei menuchato, ana ba'al harachamim hastirehu b'seter kanafecha le'olamim, utzror b'tzror hachayim, et nishmato, Adonai hu nachlato, v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo, v'nomar amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure souls. To the soul of Carl Cohen, Kapel Mordechai, ben Yehudit, v'Yaakov HaKohen, who is returning to his eternal home in you. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace in eternity. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life continually, and may he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. We call up pallbearers at this time, and we will follow the casket out directly in procession. Following the pallbearers will be family, and then we will follow them.